Hi everybody, Andrew Cuneo here. Today I wanted to dive back into Historic a little bit. With the most recent release of Baldur's Gate and some of the nerfs that were done to some cards in Historic, I think it's maybe made it possible to play Death Shadow in Historic. Which, when Death Shadow was released, maybe more than a year ago at this point, in one of the Historic anthologies, people thought that it would have an impact on Historic, and it really just didn't have any impact at all. And there were a couple of reasons for that, but I think that some of those might not be true anymore, so I'm going to go over what that was. I'm going to go over this deck I've built, and I'm going to go ahead and play it some. So there were two big reasons that Death Shadow, which has been a really successful card in Modern and occasionally in Legacy, was not a successful card in Historic. One of them was that it wasn't that hard to... It was too hard to control your life total, or at least to get your life total low in Historic. In Modern, there's a card called Street Wraith, which you can pay life to cycle, but don't have to pay any mana. There's Dismember, a removal spell that allows you to pay life. There used to be Gitaxian Probe, which is another card that you can essentially cycle for free by paying life. And we didn't have any of those tools in Historic. We were basically relying mostly on taking damage from the lands, which is primarily the shock lands like Godless Shrine, and also these double-faced lands that, you can pay 3 life to have them be untapped. That's where a lot of the life loss was coming from in order to make Death Shadow a castable card. In Modern, especially when you used to be able to play the Gitaxian Probe, you would sometimes be able to play your Death Shadow on turn 1 because you could literally spend... You could spend, easily 11 life on your first turn if you drew enough of those 0-mana cycling cards. And you also had access to fetch lands, which you could go and get shock lands. So you could your first land you played, you would pay 3 life for most of the time because you'd be playing fetch land like Bloodstained Mire. You would be going and using it to get a shock land like Blood Crypt or whatever colors you wanted to play. And so you were paying more life for your lands than you typically do in Historic. Even though there are these lands that pay 3 life, these are not as good as the fetch lands. So one of the big problems was you couldn't pay enough life early on in the game. The other problem was, two more problems. Second problem was you just couldn't play enough good cards because you didn't have fetch lands, and you needed to play a bunch of ways that your lands were going to damage you. It was really hard to build a functional 3-color mana base. I thought it was basically impossible when I tried in the past. And I think that's still the case when there's no fetch lands and you're forced to play lands like Agadeem's Awakening or Ifnir Deadlands. You just can't play 3 colors, which led to the problem that there just weren't enough good cards for the deck in Historic. So even if you were comfortable with how much life you were able to make yourself lose, once you had your Death Shadow in your deck, and eventually you had Scourge of the Skyclaves, and just the rest of your cards weren't that good. There weren't enough good cards to make a competitive deck. There's been a bunch of stuff released since then, so I'm going to go over some of the new additions in a second. That's no longer a problem. Third problem, and this was perhaps the biggest problem, was Cauldron Familiar, which... This has been a staple of Alchemy for as long as it's existed. Let me move my image so you can see it a little better. This card used to be able to block in Historic. So the idea that you were going to make a gigantic Death Shadow and you were going to attack with it on the ground and that was going to work just if you played against someone who had Witch's Oven and Cauldron Familiar, it wasn't going to work. It was a hopeless endeavor. So they've nerfed Cauldron Familiar in Historic so that it can no longer block, meaning that if you make a gigantic ground creature, it's going to be a lot harder for most decks to deal with than it used to be. It used to be that gigantic ground creatures without trample or some form of unblockability, it was just a joke to try to play them in Historic because of Cauldron Familiar. That may no longer be the case. So this getting nerfed, step number 1, I think, in maybe making this a playable deck. And then step number 2 is there's been some new cards printed, so you're no longer kind of limited by there just not being enough good spells that fit in this deck. So there's a couple of cards I've added. Number one is this new card, Mind Spike. This is kind of like a hybrid between a Duress and a Thoughtseize, but you pay life when you make them discard. The upside is, versus Duress, is if it whiffs, you get to draw a card. I think this card in most contexts is worse than Duress. But in this context of this specific deck where you want your spells to cost you life, this is like a better Duress, pretty clearly. So I've added 4 of those to my deck. Another newish card is Painful Bond. Now, Painful Bond's gone through a series of revisions. It now works in the way that if you filled your deck with cheap cards, they start costing you life to cast. I've got 4 of them in my deck. I've only played 1 match with this deck so far. 4 may be a little bit too many. It's possible my deck actually has too much life loss in it now. But either way, Painful Bond is a very strong card. It was an incredible card before it got nerfed, but even with this nerfed version, it's still a very strong card. So that's another new addition that I think is pretty important. I've got Esper Sentinel in my deck, which is not a particularly synergistic card in this deck. Most decks that play Esper Sentinel, they're getting a little bit of additional value from it, either because it's an artifact or it's a human, or they're playing auras that are going to buff it up. I don't have any of that stuff. I'm just playing an honest Esper Sentinel. But Esper Sentinel is an incredibly good card, and I think it's very important if you're going to be playing with Scourge of the Skyclaves, you want to play with 1-drops that are going to damage your opponent so that Scourge of the Skyclave becomes castable on turn 2. So in my deck, I've got 4 Esper Sentinels, 4 Knight of the Even Legions. So I can conceivably play one of these on turn 1, take some damage from one of my lands, and then I'm able to play Scourge of the Skyclaves on turn 2, assuming that this creature got to connect for a point of damage. So that, I think, is where the Esper Sentinel fits in. Honestly, it would be nice to find a different 1-drop that was a little bit better, but I think this is the best one that's available now. So the creature complement is Esper Sentinels, Death Shadows, Knight of the Even Legion, like we went over, Scourge of the Skyclaves, and then Adanto Vanguard. This is the reason I'm playing white. Adanto Vanguard gives you a way to control your life total at instant speed, which is incredible for a deck that's using Death Shadow and Scourge of the Skyclaves. You wind up in situations where your opponent might feel like, okay, I'm going to have a turn or two before I need to block these Death Shadows that you've got in play, and you just cast Adanto Vanguard pre-combat, you attack with your Death Shadows. Now you have the ability to make your Death Shadows lethal at instant speed, so they're forced to block. It just, the ability to really pay a lot of life and at instant speed makes combat very hard for your opponent. Also, Adanto Vanguard is just a pretty good card on its own. So we got 4 of those. That is the main draw, I think, of being white. If you're wondering, basically, if you're going to play a Death Shadow deck, you can't play it as mono black because you're not going to get enough lands that damage you. You could just play a ton of shock lands that are just off-color shock lands if you wanted to. I think you're not going to get enough spells, and I think it's easy enough to build a mana base that supports 2 colors, so you should pick a second color. I think Adanto Vanguard's the best card for this deck that is a non-black card, so I would definitely play white. Rounding out the deck, I've got a little bit of removal, basically. Some Bloodchief's Thirst, some Fatal Pushes. It's been a while since I played Historic. I don't really have a strong feel for which of these 2 is better. It is, if there were fetch lands, it would easily be Fatal Push, because then you could enable Revolt. This deck does not really enable Revolt. You're just relying on your opponents killing your creatures for Revolt to be turned on. Also, 1 Vanishing Verse. I just wanted to try it. It is basically the reason. And then there are 23 lands, including Agadeem's Awakening and Emeria's Call. Agadeem's Awakening, I think, is a card that is going to be cast some of the time in this deck. Emeria's Call, you're probably never going to cast it, but you just want your lands to damage you. And you could play more shock lands, and they would be slightly less damaging. I think it's good to have the land be more damaging. And every once in a while, you'll cast Emeria's Call. For Ifnir Deadlands, this is a land that you may have never seen before if you haven't been playing since Amonkhet. So this is basically just a swamp that deals a point of damage to you whenever you tap it. It goes it's part of the theme that you want your lands to deal damage to you. It also has this ability that for effectively 5 mana and sacking it, you can put -1/-1 counters, 2 -1/-1 counters on something. So it is like a really weak removal spell, a weak way to get value from your land. And then I've got 4 Godless Shrines. It's absolutely mandatory to play 4 Godless Shrines. I've got some Sacred Foundries. These are literally just off-color shock lands, so they give me a way to take some damage from my lands. 1 basic Swamp, which is kind of a nod to Field of Ruin. I think it's the first one you get decent value out of. I would not play more than 1 basic land. 4 Concealed Courtyards, just to have some more white-black dual lands. The colored mana in this deck is not incredibly good. If you look, I have 14 sources of white mana right now for 9 spells. That's not ideal, but if you want your lands to damage you, you just can't play that many dual lands. So I've got the 4 good ones for my deck, and then I've got 4 Concealed Courtyards, which it's a little bit of a bummer to be playing this many lands that you don't have the option of damaging yourself with them, but you need to play more than 4 dual lands to have a functional 2-color deck. In Historic, I would say. So I've got Concealed Courtyards. That's the mana base. I am playing with Lurrus. Historic is one of the few remaining formats where you're still allowed to play with Lurrus. The one restriction that it placed on my deck building was I would have considered playing with Maul of the Skyclaves if I was not playing a Lurrus deck. So this is just a really good way to give your Death Shadow or your Scourge of the Skyclaves evasion. Right now, I don't have any ways to give my giant ground creatures evasion, so I'm just relying on the idea that the fact that there's no longer Cauldron Familiar means that they're not going to be that effectively blocked. Looking at the sideboard, I've got some more discard in the form of some more Duresses, some more removal in the form of Fatal Pushes, Allegion's End. This is I really like playing this card against blue-white Auras style decks, or any Auras style deck, really. 1 Fragment Reality. I think this is just a really good card. I've liked playing it in white decks. Some Containment Priest. This is mostly against Collected Company decks. Some Go Blanks. I've got 3 of them. This is my anti-graveyard card of choice. You can't play Leyline of the Void with Lurrus. I could be playing some, Lanterns, Soul Guide Lantern or one of those variants, but I think Go Blank's probably going to be better for me. And I've got some Witch's Vengeances. They're not against any particular deck, but having a one-sided sweeper I think is pretty nice. So we'll see if they prove to be useful. I do think that this deck is... the main deck is pretty tight. I don't know that you're going to really want to be able to sideboard that much in any particular matchup. I think it's just an issue of, are the removal spells good? If they're not, you're going to want to swap them. Is Esper Sentinel good? Maybe you want to swap that for more removal. It's pretty much the main plan. I have not played yet against any really aggressive red decks to figure out if you need to actually have some ways to gain life in the sideboard. From Modern, usually when you would play Death Shadow against Burn, it wasn't a matchup you wanted to play, but it wasn't that bad because you would just try to avoid dealing damage to yourself with your lands or your spells that dealt damage with you, and you would just rely on your Death Shadows getting turned on by virtue of the fact that your opponent's deck only functioned by dealing damage to you. So you just play your hand out a little bit slower, and then the Death Shadows still eventually become good, and it's pretty good in that way. But this is draft 1 of the deck, so we'll see. The sideboard is always the thing that I think that a little bit of play makes it come into focus, really what you need to have in your sideboard. So let's dive into some games and find out. All right. Got plenty of ways to damage myself. I don't have any way to enable the Scourge of the Skyclaves. I think this hand is fine, though. Turn 1 Thoughtseize, turn 2 Painful Bond. The only real issue is how much do I want to damage myself. I think I'm going to lead on the Godless Shrine and Thoughtseize them. And then I'll figure out what their deck is, and from there we can figure out how much damage we want to be taking. So this is an elf deck. I think I'll just take Collecting Company because it's the best card. If they didn't have multiple 2-drops, it might have been tempting to take a 2-drop. We'll play this. And because I haven't drawn a Death Shadow, I think I'm going to actually go a little bit slow on the damaging myself with the lands. The Scourge of the Skyclave, I need to damage myself some, but I also need to damage them just as much. So I'm going to play the Adanto Vanguard this turn, just because it will hit harder than the Scourge of the Skyclave next turn. Also, now that I have the Adanto Vanguard against a mono green deck, they're probably never going to be able to kill it, meaning that I can make my Scourge of the Skyclave big if I want to. I maybe should have used the Adanto Vanguard on my turn just to make this thing a 2-3. I didn't think about doing that. Definitely want to get rid of this War Master. And I am going to deal 4 damage to myself because this triggers the Knight of the Ebon Legion, so I don't need to spend mana on it to get it through a 2-2 anymore. This is... I said when I was going over the deck that it was nice that, you know, they removed Cauldron Familiar so there was no longer all this garbage you had to get through on the ground, but I'm immediately paired up against a deck that is nothing but chump blockers on the ground. I'm going to pay life. Would go to 4. Yeah, I think I do. I do have a minor ability to gain life with Lurrus if the game goes long enough. Gonna need to be a little bit careful though. This is going to force him to block with at least one creature when I attack. I think that I'm dead if they block really conservatively. Oh, also they can just do that. That's not good for me. If they don't block the Scourge of the Skyclaves, I win. No, I don't win. I'm just dead. This was a really bad attack. I think I messed this game up by not making my Knight of the Ebon Legion a 2-3 on the second turn with the Adanto Vanguard. If I had just done that, I would have been able to play the Scourge of Skyclave one turn sooner, and my hand might have been fast enough. Playing with Death Shadows is very tricky. Alright, so we got Witch's Vengeance, which is obviously great in this matchup. I think I like Fragment Reality. They've got probably a fair amount of 1-mana cards in their deck. Definitely like Fatal Push. I guess I like Containment Priest. I said it was in my sideboard for when I faced company decks, and that's what I'm facing. There's also Legion's End is great. Noxious Grasp is... and it kills their stuff. Maybe it's better than some of my other options. It is 2 mana. I definitely do not want Esper Sentinel in my deck. Probably I don't even need Mind Spike. Maybe I should cut Bloodchief's Thirst. Is that my worst removal spell? Might be. The fact that Fatal Push is an instant, I think, makes it substantially better. Definitely want to get Adanto Vanguard into play. Question is, do I want to grow this? I think I do. Okay. Well, Witch's Vengeance was certainly very good this game. Emeria's Call flooded. That all seemed... I think I like the way I configured my deck. Maybe on the draw I should cut Vanishing Verse for the Bloodchief's Thirst. Just to have the additional cheap card. Additional answer to a turn 1 Llanowar Elf. We'll see if I can win a game on the draw if I don't draw Witch's Vengeance. Or we'll also see if I could win a game where I do draw Witch's Vengeance. Given that I drew Death Shadows, I definitely want to deal max damage to myself with my lands. At least initially. I haven't seen that card in a long time. So they're going to knock me down to 13. Maybe I actually don't want to necessarily deal a ton of damage to myself with Emeria's Call. I'm going to defer that decision for one turn. I think it costs 6 mana to activate. Hoping they're not going to block. Or they could also maybe make a mistake and double block with 2/2/2s, and then my Ifnir Deadlands would just kill them both. They could also double block with a Thorn Lieutenant and a 2/2, in which case I would just trade with the Thorn Lieutenant. How much does this thing cost to use? 6? Okay. These are all things that are kind of bad for me. If I get a 6 and I kill the Imperious Perfect, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 attackers. I'm dead to a land because of the Sentinel plus the Allosaurus Shepherd. This makes everything 5/5s. If I attack with 2 things, they don't block, they swing back, I go block, block, take 5. I die to a Lord. If I leave 3 things back, I still die to a Lord. I die to a land, I die to a Lord, so I'm just hoping they draw some sort of... Like, I'm hoping they draw Llanowar Elves or Allosaurus Shepherd or maybe Esper Sentinel. Or Collected Company that doesn't do anything because I have a Containment Priest in play. That's a nice one. So now they have to block all 3 of these. And I think I want Lurrus in my hand more than I want to be able to pump the Knight of the Even Legion on defense. Okay, that's another card I can potentially win if they draw. A Lord. Does this give trample? I don't think so. This game is very close. So should I Painful Bond before I play Lurrus? I'd potentially be going to 5 life. What could I draw that would be good? I guess I could have drawn Witch's Vengeance. Maybe I should have done that pre-combat. Probably should have thought about that before I attacked. Very close. Hand does not have a 1 mana play. I'm not even going to deal damage to myself with my lands this game because I drew 2 Adanto Vanguards. I should be able to control my life total pretty easily. They shocked Watery Grave into play and didn't do anything. Makes me feel like the most likely card for them to have in their hand is Fatal Push. I'm going to attack first. If I hadn't drawn this Mind Spike, I would have just played another Vanguard. I'm going to Mind Spike them to see what's going on. Could be a little bit awkward if I see a handful of Censors and Jawari Disruptions that I played this way. But it is a big upside if I take their 1 Fatal Push and I just get to cast Scourge of the Skyclaves this turn. We have a Fatal Push. Tainted Indulgence, Shadow's Verdict. I guess I'm just going to take Tainted Indulgence and I'm going to try to kill them with Adanto Vanguards. I can play Archmage's Charm this turn now. Meaning I'm going to lead on Painful Bond. I definitely want to play a spell that they feel like they want to counter this turn. So they can't just play Archmage's Charm to draw 2 for free. And this works fine. I'm just going to play yet another Adanto Vanguard, and they're going to feel like they have to counter it, which they can counter it with Drown in the Loch now. So there's some sort of blue-black control deck. I think I'm just going to board out all of my removal spells. I didn't even see what, presumably they have something in their deck I'd want to remove, but I don't even know what it is. I'm just going to board in Duresses and go blanks. And just be a mountain of discard and some hard-hitting creatures. Death Shadow, we can't play on turn 1, but I do have Painful Bond. I do have a turn 2 Vanguard. I'll keep it. This is on the weaker end of hands I would consider keeping. It might look like a good hand, like it's 4 lands, 3 spells, good colored mana. But not having a 1 mana play on the draw in Historic is a little rough. Certainly if I knew I was playing against a, not a slow deck, I would be looking to mulligan this hand, I think. I wonder if my opponent has anything they board in against Adanto Vanguard. Adanto Vanguard can be a really annoying card for control decks if they haven't specifically prepared for it.
There are so many mysteries to uncover. I have just the trick for this.
Archmage's Charm. Archmage's Charm is an annoying card against Death Shadow. Alright, let's kill the Narset first. Then play Painful Bond, see if I can find a discard spell. Found a Mind Spike. Doesn't really matter what I do with my lands, given that I have this Adanto Vanguard that I'd be paying life if I didn't pay life. On the lands. Basically, I'm just going to want to get my life total down to about 10-ish next turn. I guess even lower because of Languish. Are they going to Languish me? No. So, if they don't respond to this, I was just going to take Tainted Indulgence. But if they do respond with the Tainted Indulgence, I can easily take Damnation, or Languish, which might be their best card. They pitched a Censor. They have Tasha. This is an answer to, Adanto Vanguard. So if they play the Tasha and they haven't drawn a land, I'll get a card off of Esper Sentinel. I'll probably want to spend a turn
Let's make this snappy. I'm busy.
killing Tasha. I mean, I can't attack with the Adanto Vanguard.
Try anything cheeky now.
Question is it worth hitting with spending all my mana to hit with that thing? Probably. I could start out by firing this off, though. I think I've paid 4 life this turn now. I will shock myself. Start the life paying early. This is an awkward hand. 2 Scourge of the Skyclaves with... Oh! I thought this was a Death Shadow. I just badly misplayed my hand. Okay. Mistakes were made. So this is some sort of unusual build of an artifact creature deck. I'll probably just pay life with this Deadlands. Get myself closer to having Death Shadow turned on. Okay. Wow, they have a Pain land? That is not ideal for them versus my Scourge of the Skyclaves. Should I Mind Spike them this turn? Doesn't seem worth it because of the Esper Sentinel. I wouldn't be able to also play the Scourge of the Skyclaves because this Concealed Courtyard has to come into play tapped. I haven't seen a Hardened Scales deck in a while. My creatures were too big for them. So this is like a artifact hardened scales deck. I think I want Fragment Reality. I think I want Legion's End, and I think I want Fatal Push. Do I want Vanishing Verse? They actually had a lot of colored permanents. Even if they were, some of them were artifacts. I don't know about Witch's Vengeance. I'm kind of concerned their cards might get too big. I think I'm just going to cut the Mind Spikes. I wonder if they have Ornithopters in their deck. I might Fragment Reality a 1-drop and have them play an Ornithopter and then feel sad. The land sequencing with this deck is not easy. I'll offer to trade with the Patchwork Automaton. I think they're not going to want to trade. I also could have, I guess I could have just played this land pre-combat and then they definitely wouldn't have blocked. It says Ward 2, I believe. Yeah. Ooh, a portable hull. That's not nice. I don't know what this wasp does. So it was bad to not draw a land. What can I do? I guess I can just play this and hope I draw a land next turn. I was hoping to be able to Fatal Push this. I don't think my deck is capable of coming back from this. So my choices are I could chump or I could block and pay 4 life. Blocking and paying 4 life just seems strictly superior to not blocking. Guess I can also just block here, which I think they're gonna use Zabaz to make they're gonna make Zabaz giant if I eat this thing. Destroy target artifact you control. Okay. So if I draw Death Shadow, I could play Death Shadow and Fatal Push that. That would be a nice turn. Legion's End. This is modular as well. Ugh. I can't win. Alright, seems like a reasonable hand. Question is, do I want to play Esper Sentinel turn 1 or Knight of the Ebon Legion turn 1? I think I'll go with Esper Sentinel. I'm going to play Knight of the Ebon Legion on turn 2 instead of the Scourge of the Skyclave, because I think there's a risk that if I just have 2/1/1s sitting in play, I wouldn't be able to attack, and then the Scourge of the Skyclave doesn't get to grow. Yeah, this is way better for me. Should probably pay life just to ding myself down to 15. Get closer to having the Death Shadow come online. I probably need to be playing with stops in my instep with these Ifnir Deadlands. It hasn't come up yet, but I would guess Arena does not give me priority to just lower my life total whenever I feel like it. I can Vanishing Verse this Portable Hole. I think that's worse than just playing another Scourge of the Skyclave, though. Well, that's a very intelligent smith with more portable holes. Two portable holes and a glass casket. This person really, they're not messing around. Yet again, Ifnir Deadlands proves to be relevant. It's not expecting to activate it twice in the course of 3 matches. They might live another turn. They would have been dead to an untapped land if they had played their 1/1 lifelinker. Alright, well, I think that's a good initial run through with that deck. I didn't have to play against any aggressive red decks, which might be a weakness of the way the deck was built. I think I was pretty happy with all the card choices over the course of those matches. If anything, it would have been nice to just have an additional Witch's Vengeance in the sideboard. That it was good in that elf matchup. Other than that, I felt like all the cards functioned pretty well. I think if you're playing with this deck and you're looking to, potentially make changes, I think that the number one area to look would be to maybe tweak the removal to make it a little bit better against whichever matchups you want to, prepare to beat, whichever matchups you think are important in the historic metagame. I don't have a great feel for what that is right now, but if you have any suggestions, please leave a comment, and I'll read them and maybe continue to work on this deck some more in historic. Thanks for watching.